Okay, class, today we're going to be talking about the specific factors model. This model allows trade to affect income distributions. So there's a couple assumptions within this model. First is that there's two goods, cloth and food. Then there's three factors of production, labor, capital, and land. And then we also assume that there's perfect competition prevails in all markets. So, cloth is produced using capital and labor, food is produced using land and labor is a mobile factor that moves between sectors, and land and capital are specific, in that they're only used in the production of one good. So how much of a good does each economy produce? Production function is a function of capital and labor for cloth. For food, it's a function of land and labor. So let's take a look at the production possibilities. So how does economy's mix of output change as labor is shifted from one sector to another? When labor moves from food to cloth, food production falls while output of cloth rises. Here's an illustration of this. This is the production function for cloth. The shape of the function reflects the law of diminishing marginal returns. So adding one worker to the production process means each worker has less capital to work with. Therefore, each additional unit of labor adds less output than the last. So this figure shows the marginal product of labor. So for the economy as a whole, total labor employed in cloth and food must equal total labor supply. And then we can derive, using these equations, we can derive the production possibilities frontier of an economy. This is a four-quadrant diagram, and it looks a little complicated at first, but it's relatively simple. The lower left quadrant indicates the allocation of labor. The lower right shows the production of function for cloth from the earlier figure 4-1. The upper left quadrant shows the corresponding production function for food, while the upper right quadrant indicates combinations of cloth and food that can be produced. Here's what that looks like. So a good question is, why is this PPF curved? And that's because of diminishing returns to labor. And the opportunity cost of cloth in terms of food is the slope of the production possibilities frontier. The slope becomes steeper as an economy produces more cloth. So opportunity cost of producing one more yard of cloth is the ratio of the marginal product of labors. To produce one more yard of cloth, you need 1 over the marginal product of labor of cloth hours more of labor. To free up 1 hour of labor, you must reduce the amount of food output by the marginal product of labor for food pounds. To produce less food and more cloths, employ less in food and more in cloth. The marginal product of labor in food rises and the marginal product of labor in cloth falls. So the ratio rises. A good question is, how much labor is employed in each sector? For that, we need to look at supply and demand for labor. Demand for labor: employers will maximize profits by demanding labor up to a point where the value produced by an additional hour equals the marginal cost of employing a worker for that hour. Here's what the formula for demand curve for labor in the cloth sector looks like, where we have the marginal product of labor times P sub C equals wage. And the wage equals the value of marginal product of labor in manufacturing. The demand curve for labor in the food sector looks like below, equation 4-5, where the marginal product labor in food times the P in food equals the wage. Figure 4-4 represents labor demand. The demand for labor in the cloth sector is the marginal product of labor in cloth multiplied by P-C, or P sub C. Demand from labor in the food sector is measured from the right, and the horizontal axis represents the total labor supply. Two sectors must pay the same wage because labor can compete between two sectors. This is because of that competitive market assumption we make. If the wage were higher in the cloth sector, workers would move from making food to making cloth until the wages become equal again. where the demand curve intersects gives us the equilibrium wage and allocation of labor between the two sectors. So here's that graphically, figure 4-4, where we have price of food times the marginal productivity of labor and food, which is the demand curve for labor and food. Then we have the demand curve for labor and cloth downwardly sloping, with the blue line there. And where they intersect is the wage. At the production point, the production possibilities frontier is tangent to a line whose slope is minus the price of cloth divided by that of food. So the relationship between relative prices and output is the negative ratio between the marginal productivities of labor equals the negative ratio of the prices. So here's what that looks like graphically. You can see the production possibilities frontier with a line that is tangent to the slope. And it intersects where the quantity of food and the quantity of cloth intersect with that tangent line. So, what happens to the allocation of labor and the distribution of income when the prices change? We have two cases: an equal proportional change in prices, where each price changed with an equal proportion, or we have a change in relative prices. So when both prices change, no real change occurs. Wage rate rises in the same proportion, so real wages are unaffected. The real income of capital owners and landowners also remain the same. Here you can see that graphically. An equal proportional increase in the prices of cloth and food, they shift upward equally by 10%, and the wage rate shifts upward equally by 10%. So when only the price of cloth rises, labor shifts from the food sector to the cloth sector, and the output of cloth rises while that of food falls. Wage rate does not rise as much as cloth since cloth employment increases and the marginal product of labor in that sector falls. So here's what that looks like graphically. Here's a figure that represents the responsive output to a change in the relative price of cloth. So we have the determination of relative prices, which is where relative supply equals relative demand. So we have relative prices and the distribution of income. Suppose that the price of cloth increases by 10%, then the wage would rise by less than 10%. The economic effect of this price increase is that workers, owners of capital, and owners of land will be affected. So first, owners of capital will definitely be better off. Landowners are definitely worse off, and we cannot say whether workers are better or worse off. This depends on the importance of cloth and food in the workers' consumption. So now let's look at some international trade within the specific factors model. We have trade and relative prices. The relative price of cloth prior to trade is determined by the intersection of the economy's relative supply and its relative demand. Free trade relative price of cloth is determined by the world relative supply and the world relative demand. Opening up to trade increases the relative price of cloth in an economy whose relative supply of cloth is larger than for the world as a whole. And that's because that economy is going to earn rents off of their excess cloth supply. And that's it for today's lecture with the specific factors model.